Suzi and Martin from Gemini Connect, and we're here to talk about cameras.
Specifically mirrorless cameras. So we both started off with DSLR cameras, and we've been shooting collectively for about 10 years, just doing product photography, event photography, food photography, a lot of different things. And we both started off, interiors. So we started off with DSLRs because everyone started off with DSLRs for the most part. And Martin started with Nikon, and I started with Canon, and now he is Fuji, and I am Sony. So we've always kind of been at odds with each other. So today we're kind of going to talk about why we've chosen our different cameras.
Yeah, so when I started shooting, I was shooting product photography for a small company. I had to shoot all their products in a little studio and then put them on the website for sale. And I tried out a few cameras, and I went with a Nikon because I thought it felt the best in my hands, honestly. I like the quality of the bodies Nikon made and still does. And there was the big rivalry back then. The big market of DSLRs was dominated by Nikon and Canon. Quite, I think, hands down, Canon won that battle in the long run, actually. More people did go for the Canons.
Yeah, so I started actually with Nikon as well. Went from a Nikon D40 to a D90 to a D700 all within a year, which was a lot of upgrading. And then ultimately I went over to Canon because I wanted to shoot video. So I went from the D700 to the 5D Mark III. And I've had this Canon 5D Mark III ever since it came out. And it still works. It works extremely well. But because, again, for video, I went over to Sony because I think Sony has just been doing a lot more with their mirrorless cameras.
That seems to be the case. It seems like most of the technological advancements right now are going straight to mirrorless and are completely just skipping the DSLRs. Yes, people did make use of especially the Mark IIIs and IVs as a digital cinema camera, and that was working out, but it always had its limitations, and it was always very large, the whole setup that you have to put together. Even though it's not a big actual movie camera, you ended up with a lot of bulk. And now that mirrorless is actually making strides way past DSLRs, many people are switching. I personally started looking at the mirrorless in 2013. I got the Fujifilm X-H1S, and I was really impressed by that camera. I had together with it the Nikon D600 because I still had to do professional jobs, and I could not have done that with the X-H100S. That's quite obvious. And so I had my Nikon, but after a while I realized how much more I'm actually shooting with the small Fujifilm than the big DSLR. And in 2016, as soon as the X-Pro2 came out, I was ready to switch, and I sold everything by Nikon, and I bought the changeable lens camera by Fujifilm and a variety of lenses, and I was able to sell everything. And I still do some professional photo shoots with my Fuji gear, but I'm not really a full-time professional photographer. I help Suzi for her photo shoots, and when I do go with her, my X-Pro2 and my X-H1 do really well, but I don't make my living that way.
But that isn't to say that you can't use Fujifilm as a professional photographer, but definitely there are some limitations. And so I specifically went to Sony because I was going on we were going on a month-long trip to Asia, and I did not want to bring this giant DSLR camera. So instead I went for this little Sony A7rIII. This is the kit lens, in fact, which is just a fantastic little kit lens. And so I used this for a month in Asia, and came back and actually started to use it as like a second body while I was shooting. So I was using these two cameras, and at the end of the day, comparing the image quality and just the experience of using these two cameras, like this little camera, just the image quality was really good. The eye autofocus and the face detect are just game changers, and there's just so much more tech in mirrorless cameras. And so as a result, when I was ready to upgrade from the Mark III, there was the Mark IV that came out, but I didn't feel like it was as up to par with this little camera. So in that sense, I was like, well, what is Sony putting out in the full frame world? And so I ended up going with the Sony A7R III. In retrospect, I maybe would have gone with the A7 III, but that came out really recently, and so by then I'd already bought the A7R III, so now I'm stuck with it. Oh shucks. But yeah, I mean, I'm loving this camera so far, and again, I got it mostly with the intention of doing video, but photo-wise, this is just a fantastic camera. And so it's features like eye autofocus, face detect, which I think Fujifilm has some of that as well.
It has some, but not as well.
Yeah, I think Sony definitely pioneered both of those features, and they're extremely good. And once you get used to how accurate eye autofocus is, that you will never want to shoot without it again. So it's things like that that I think are good for professional needs, and it's also just the array of lenses that are available. I think Sony is still very much behind from Canon and Nikon, which have been producing, fantastic high quality lenses for much longer. They still have a bigger variety of lenses, and they're still kind of restricted on the Sony end. But there's still more Sony lenses out there for professional needs than Fujifilm.
I would not be too, maybe so, but
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think Fuji gives you the most bang for the buck when it comes to lenses of any brand for anything. I find that I like the Fuji lens the more they give you the most value, and the quality you get for the sizes they are is also really, really good. They're all made of metal, they're all made in Japan, they're all extremely sharp, and I personally like my Fuji lenses a lot more than any lens.
I would say physically, construction-wise, Sony or Fujifilm lenses are definitely they're more compact. They feel like they're all metal, and yeah, you're right. Like they're just incredibly sharp.
Yeah, and no distortions either on the Fujis. Very, very low, or if any at all.
Fuji lenses are good. I think the issue with both Sony and Fujifilm though comes with like your more specialty lenses. Like for example, I recently bought a tilt shift lens for architecture photography. Now Canon makes at least three of those tilt shift lenses, and they're extremely good. They're about $1,800 a piece, but they're really, really good tilt shift lenses. Sony does not make a tilt shift lens. I had to buy a Rokinon, like a third-party lens, which I'm still not entirely sure how well that's going to turn out, but I don't think Fujifilm either makes a tilt shift lens. Yeah. So when you need specialty lenses like that, and even like, your super telephoto zooms, which, average people won't need them, even pros don't necessarily need them all the time, but if I need a 300 millimeter, 400 millimeter f2.8, I think Sony is starting to develop that, but they're not as tried and true as Canon and Nikon.
Yeah, where you miss out on possibilities with the Fuji is at the low light, the low light situations. You don't have so many of the 2.8 lenses that you have with your Canons, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
When you go and shoot a concert with your something like a 70-200, right, 2.8, there is no such lens for a Fuji. You have to really bump up your eyes. So yet. Another big thing is in the Fuji world still you don't have a full frame, so in a low light environment you're actually quite disadvantaged as a Fuji shooter compared to Canon, and recently even Sony is now with this full frame there, and with some of their nicest lenses are coming pretty close. I really love shooting with two of my lenses which are zooms, and the 1855 is my favorite lens. But when I have to shoot far away, I really like the 55-200, and on the crop that becomes a 300. And it's not that big of a lens; it's something like this length, compared to almost any other brand. To have that zoom, it would be huge. Yeah, and I shot a professional photo shoot for a big food event here in Seattle, and there was a stage show for the most part going on. I had absolutely no problem indoors. It wasn't the most light. Yet the photos came out fantastic and were very well received by the client with that lens, so it wasn't a detriment to me that I didn't have a 2.8 Canon lens like the 70-200.
Yeah, and I'd say overall, like, traditionally people might be like, oh, these are the top professional lenses that all professional photographers should have. And a lot of them are going to be, f2.8 lenses at least. But with these newer, camera bodies that can shoot at, higher ISOs, that means that you don't necessarily need a 2.8 lens anymore. Like for example, this is the 24-70 f4 lens, and I've been shooting with a 24-70 f2.8 lens on Canon for a long time. Still have that lens. That was another reason why I'm like, I don't need two of the same lens. But I ended up going with a 24-70 f4 from my Sony A7rIII. And just size-wise, it's a lot smaller. It's only $700, $800. I bought this used on Craigslist actually. It's been an excellent lens.
So one of the big sticking points all along for people to switch over to mirrorless, even though they like them more, they're smaller and nicer, was that there were no full frames for a long time. And Sony changed that, right? Sony was the first one to make a full frame, and you bought one. And you were mentioning that the A7rIII came out, but I actually think you really are benefiting from the full frame on your camera right now. And I've actually seen a dramatic increase of the quality of the photos you take since you bought this camera. So at first I was like, oh man, you could have saved $1,000 and bought the other one. But now that I've seen the result, I actually think you did the right thing by getting the full frame camera.
Yeah, so the A7R III has 42 megapixels on each raw image, which is a lot. So I bought a lot of hard drives since buying this camera because
Yeah.
the files are enormous. But that's a good thing if you need the extra file size. So for landscapes, which is mostly what I've actually been shooting with this camera, funny enough, and architecture photography, it's fantastic because you generally do need a few extra megapixels. This also has pixel shift, which is kind of like focus stacking, really. So it just moves the focus point on the sensor while you're taking sort of like a bracketed image, and it just gives you like this ultra high res image that is just so sharp.
So it packs what 4 pixels where one would have been, and
something like that.
and
Yeah.
so it increases it even more beyond the 42 megapixels. It goes to super sharp.
And your file size is even bigger that way, but it's really cool if you actually need that kind of resolution. And again, for architecture, for landscapes, you can definitely argue that that's a really cool feature that, as far as I know, is only available on, I think, the A7R III, probably the A7 III. So that's a
that's a big
nice
advantage. So
nice reason to have a bigger full frame sensor.
That's right. And me as a Fuji shooter right now, I don't even have that option. The rumor is that in September they will release the X-T3 with the full frame, but it will remain lower megapixel kind of full frame like the A7 III actually. So I don't even have such an option. So many people who do need that kind of resolution, they have to go either for a Sony or stick to the DSLRs. However, Fujifilm did make the GFX, which is a medium format. That's even bigger than a full frame. But those are still so new that you are very limited when it comes to lens. And right now they're ramping up, releasing many more lenses for that line. But it's something they need to invest time and money in, and it will not happen overnight. But I am seeing a lot of people who are in particular into fashion and portraits are very much buying into the GFX line right now because of that huge resolution it gets.
So this is the X-H1, which is a crop sensor.
That's right.
Camera. Compare that with the A7R III, a full frame, and this is Sony's little crop sensor.
That is right.
Which is so cute.
So you can quite easily tell that Sony does manage to pack DMOS technology in the smallest amount of size. Yes.
I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, because even the 42 megapixel full frame Sony is smaller than this X-H1, which is a crop. And they both have IBIS. They say they made this bigger to accommodate for the IBIS, but Sony does have IBIS, even though it's not as good as the Fujifilm one.
Yeah,
for
I
the
don't
moment.
think so. I think Fujifilm definitely wins with IBIS, actually.
Yeah, we'll get into that comparison between the two latest cameras we got. But yeah, when it comes to full frame, you get that from a Sony. You don't get that from a Fuji. I think they will change that, but it will take a bit until the X-T3 comes out. And even then, you will have it, but the talk is that you won't have the IBIS at that point. So Fuji is a bit more niche, I would say. But the biggest reason there are a few reasons I really like the Fujis, but I find that it feels really good in my hands and the controls are superb. And I really am into the controls. I love the old style dials. I love the way the body is made of very high quality materials. Fuji tends to make their stuff in Japan, almost everything. And so everything coming out of Fuji is really kind of it's more niche targeted, but it's very high quality. And the people who shoot Fuji really love shooting Fuji, and they don't care much for other brands. And for me, when I get Sony and I try to shoot with it, I get frustrated very quickly, mostly because of the controls. If I ever have to get into the menu, I give up because it's like a jungle. Fuji controls make a lot more sense to me.
So I don't agree, actually. I don't like the layout of Fuji. I don't like the dials, and it's just, for me, it was a lot to get used to. And I actually get really frustrated when I'm trying to shoot with Fuji because I never shot film. I don't really have like all of that nostalgic kind of design is kind of lost on me. I mean, I think it looks cool, but in terms of using it, I don't like the dials. I actually strongly prefer, I don't know if I strongly prefer Sony because Sony also is really annoying, but in its own ways. But I think I've just gotten, and I've really only shot with DSLRs, so I'm just so used to DSLR layouts. Going from Nikon to Canon DSLRs actually wasn't the biggest deal for me. I adapted to that pretty quickly. But in that sense, I actually feel like Sony has a more similar layout to DSLRs, and as a result, it's been easier for me to customize my Sony so that you're right. Like the menu is packed, and it takes a lot to go through the menu. I kind of think of Sony's as being like Photoshop. Like there's just so much you can do with the camera, kind of like Photoshop, that it can get really, really frustrating just to do basic things. So yeah, so I mean, to me, the trick with Sony's is just to use your custom settings and to customize your camera heavily. Which again, kind of sucks if you ever have to be in a situation where you have to reset your camera. But if you customize your settings, you can get it pretty close to a DSLR. And so for me, like that's just how I like to shoot. And so I still tend to shoot, do my wide shots with my DSLR and do like my tight shots with my Sony. So I can flip pretty easily between DSLR and Sony. So that's how I like to shoot and have my controls set up.
Yeah, I like the rangefinder controls. Those controls more. I find it much more easy to take a shot and be inspired when all of the controls are on my fingertips and they're analog, and all the basic controls are very accessible in the case of the Fuji. Focus, joystick, everything is really, really good there. So I can't give that up. And someone said in the Fujifilm group that I'm on Facebook that Sony is a computer, not a camera, and it actually resonates with what you just said about having to program it before
it feels
actually.
That way.
Yeah, well, with the Fujifilm, you just grab it and you can immediately shoot. You have everything on your fingertips, and I really, really like that.
Yeah, I would say, like the few times that I have shot with your cameras, and again, after I get over that initial just like, oh, what am I doing? I don't know how to take a picture anymore. I would agree that like your controls are more accessible. They're more obvious because there's dedicated buttons for everything. Versus with Sony, like you can just program things. So the way that I've set up my camera would be totally different probably from how someone else has set up their camera. So it'd be harder for me to take someone else's A7rIII and maybe shoot with it because everyone has set up their own custom dials to be different.
Yeah, and the continuity, I think, between everyone's Fuji, you can grab anyone's and shoot, and you can also always grab a different kind of Fujifilm camera and start shooting very well with it right away because it just continues across the spectrum in a very similar manner that people just say, oh, that's my camera right here, and just pick it up and shoot. I like that works well. Another big thing about the switch between mirrorless and DSLR is that DSLRs, I think, have superior viewfinders. And for a long time, the mirrorless came nowhere near there. And that was actually the biggest thing for me when I switched from mirrorless to DSLR, getting used to composing with the viewfinder. Luckily, Fuji is actually really, really good at that because in the X-Pro2 in particular, which I have, it has both optical and electronic viewfinder. It has this hybrid version. You can switch between them, and you can compose in a variety of ways. You even have this way of anticipating things that are out of frame because you see so much more than you actually is in your frame. So when it comes to things like street photography and certain styles, you really can't beat the viewfinder of the Fuji, and it actually has helped me out transition.
Yeah, I actually, the EVF took some time to get used to, and I actually would love it if there was the option to switch between an electronic viewfinder and an optical viewfinder. And I looked this up, and I don't think that there's a way to do that on a Sony, unfortunately.
No, it doesn't exist anywhere but Fuji.
Because, for everything that's good about shooting with an EVF, sometimes you just don't want it. Like, for me, especially when I'm shooting indoors, when I'm shooting concerts, and you're in almost pitch dark lighting, and the only lights you have are bright red or blue and just all kinds of colors, and your EVF just doesn't show you anything. I just can't compose that way, so I have a hard time shooting certain subjects like concerts with the EVF, and those are times when I just wish I could just shut it off. And that's also why I tend to stick to Canon for certain things like concerts, mostly because of the viewfinder, honestly.
Yeah, it's a big thing. So more work probably needs to be done to take some of the viewfinders out there to professional quality that people can rely on.
Yeah, just a more versatile quality, because sometimes you don't want an EVF. Like if you're outdoors and you have natural lighting, then fine. But when you're indoors and you have all kinds of artificial lighting, just confusing everything. And I think that's another thing that is kind of drives me nuts about Sony is are the colors. I think Canon colors are a lot better. Even Fujifilm colors are a lot better.
I think Fujifilms are the best colors.
Yeah, they're pretty good and are just more accurate. Like And I think that that's actually something that came out with the A7R III, because the A6300 I thought actually has better colors. The or the white balance is much more accurate, and the A7R III just always feels like it's too warm, and it just doesn't always nail white balance. I have to constantly set it, and that has never been the case with my Canons or even the A6300.
So the next other thing about the big distinction between DSLRs and mirrorless is that DSLRs have big, nice batteries. They let you get a lot of shots out of them. And in the case of my Fuji in particular, and other mirrorless too, it's actually quite ridiculous. I have to go with something like 6 batteries when I'm out shooting with 2 bodies for a day. So I make sure that through the day I don't run out, and that is really crazy. So I see that as a great area for improvement for Fujifilm.
Yeah, so here we go. Here is the Canon DSLR battery, which is actually quite good. It lasts pretty long. This is the mirrorless battery from the A6300 and I think also the A7R II. Very small, does not last terribly long. You would need, at least 5 or 6 of these to get through a day. And this is the new Z battery from the A7R III and the A7 III. It's a lot bigger in size. It compares more closely to the DSLR battery, and it lasts just as long. I have yet to go through a whole day of shooting and filming where this battery has died on me yet. So Sony is making some pretty big strides in the battery world, and I think they're actually working to dispel that myth that mirrorless cameras don't last very long, because definitely with this new Sony battery, like, they're starting to.
Yeah, I'm jealous. That's one thing, hands down, Sony has a lot better than Fujifilm.
Yeah.
So that's really most of the comparison in general between mirrorless and DSLRs. We do think mirrorless is the present and the future, to be honest, and we have both equipped ourselves with 2 mirrorless each. So we're moving on, and we see that as the general trend.
Yeah, and even both Canon and Nikon, I think, have confirmed through the rumor blogs and through statements of their own that they're going to start to enter the mirrorless market more seriously and release a pro-level body, each of them, I think, in 2019. So it's going to get very interesting to see what happens. I think the biggest challenge with both Nikon and Canon and their mirrorless cameras is what lens mount are they going to have, because they can't exactly just forego all of the DSLR lenses that they've been building up. Or they can, but then it's going to be really tough for them to start from scratch and try to compete with Sony and Fujifilm.
Yeah, because these 2 brands are very well positioned, and they have their fan bases, they have their loyal customers. There's no way I'm switching away from Fuji no matter what Canon or Nikon does. So we're going to see a big struggle. If you look at the financial results Fujifilm released a few days ago, they're doing very, very well, seeing massive growth, even in the instant cameras, but also in their digital cameras. And they're doing well. They're investing. They even tried to acquire Xerox completely a few months ago. So we'll see how others can compete. And Fujifilm's internal memo said that they expect their rivals that make DSLRs to lose something like 50% market share in the next few years, which is insane.
I mean, that's probably true, and I think that's also why both Canon and Nikon are moving towards mirrorless. But yeah, it's just a question of, by the time they enter, Sony will have had several years of innovation ahead of them. This is the A7R III, so they're on their 3rd generation. And so typically, you wouldn't want to invest in, the base or the very first camera, which is kind of what you did with the X-H1. And you can even say that, you're seeing some things in the X-H1 that are probably going to be fixed on the X-H2.
That is true. Yeah,
so,
there are things. So yeah. I guess we can safely say we're very happy mirrorless users, and eventually we'll be full-on mirrorless. I haven't touched the DSLR in years at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm keeping DSLRs for now, because I do have a hope that Canon can get their act together and actually release a decent mirrorless camera. But yeah, it's just a matter of when and what lens mount are they going to use. So yeah, I'm not ruling it out as a possibility that I could possibly try to switch back to Canon at some point, but we'll just have to wait and see what happens next year.
That's right. And now let's move on to comparing the latest releases, the X-H1 with the Sony A7rIII.